Listen to the slow metallic rhythm of the pendulum swinging through the shadows of the room. The sound captures the steady progression of the hours, anchoring your mind to the gentle descent into rest. We trap time inside circles of glass and brass, watching the hands complete their daily journey. Yet the true scale of our history defies these small boundaries. Let your mind stretch that familiar dial across the vast, overwhelming expanse of human existence, compressing 250,000 years into the span of a single 24-hour day. The hands lock into place at midnight. Underneath a canopy of indifferent stars, the first beings who carry our exact reflections step onto the dirt of an untamed world. You can't distinguish their eyes from your own, yet they stand at the starting line of an agonizingly slow march. The ticking slows to a near halt, morphing into the vast, echoing silence of ancient time, a stillness stretching across the horizons of the earth. We wait in the dark. The hour hand traces the face of the clock, rotating endlessly while entire mountain ranges shed their rock, and vast rivers change their courses. For 23 hours and 59 minutes, the hands of your ancestors hold nothing but the familiar weight of stone. They shape the edges of flint, striking rock against rock in the fading twilight, tracking the movements of herds through the dust and seeking shelter from the biting cold of volcanic winters. The centuries bleed into millennia, stacking upon one another like fallen leaves, yet the tools remain identical. The very same tear-shaped hand axes rest in the palms of generations for over 1 million years, creating a technological silence echoing across the continents. It's a stagnation resisting the passage of time. Then the sweeping hand crosses the threshold of the final minute, and the silence breaks. This single minute delivers an avalanche of invention, the sudden stacking of mud bricks, the satisfying indentation of a reed stylus pressing into soft river clay, and the chaotic sprawl of early cities. The geometry of towering pyramids cuts through the desert winds. The final seconds of our day arrive, compressing an explosion of human ambition into a chaotic blink of an eye. The wooden wheels of horse-drawn carriages rattle against cobblestones, fading seamlessly into the metallic roar of steam engines tearing through the valleys. The delicate canvas wings of the Wright brothers catch the wind, giving way almost instantly to the towering steel cylinders of spacecraft tearing through the atmosphere. The staccato clicking of early telegraphs dissolves into the silent glowing screens of smartphones, while our robotic envoys carve their treads into the frozen red dust of Mars. You look at this timeline, and you don't see a steady climb but a sudden, dizzying launch. We lived in the quiet shadows for 250,000 years before the spark caught fire. Tell me, softly in the comments below, from what quiet corner of the world are you listening to this, and what time is it there as the night settles around you? For those seeking to hold the echoes of these ancient nights in their hands, the pages of our sleepytimehistory.com book offer a resting place for your thoughts. Yet the question remains, lingering in the quiet moments before sleep takes hold. What kept our ancestors locked in that silent, unchanging rhythm for so long, and what unseen force finally pushed them into the light? 300,000 years ago, the continent of Africa breathes under a changing sky. The climate swings like a pendulum, shifting from the lush abundance of green corridors to the suffocating grip of deadly drought. The sun bakes the earth, baking the soil until it fractures into geometric webs of dry mud, reducing vast, shimmering lakes to shallow pools of stagnant water choked with reeds. Your ancestors navigate this brutal unpredictability, walking through a world dominated by giants. The dry savanna grass crumbles beneath their bare feet, the golden stalks scratching against their skin, sending tiny clouds of red dust into the stifling, windless air. They move in small, isolated bands of 20 to 50 people, communicating through subtle gestures and low whispers, relying on the quiet strength of the group to ward off the shadows. You won't find cities or walls here, only the fragile bonds of kin standing together against an overwhelming landscape. Listen to the rustling of the tall grass, a deep, vibrating, guttural rhythm of breathing hides just beyond the edge of sight, belonging to massive, unseen predators stalking the perimeter of the camp. The scale of the animals roaming these plains challenges the limits of the imagination. Elephants 3 times the size of their modern descendants cast long, suffocating shadows over the brush. Giant buffalo drag horn spans taller than a grown human through the scrub, their hooves striking the earth with the force of falling boulders. Rhinos armoured in thick plates of hide graze in the distance, their snorts echoing through the valleys. Giant hyenas and saber-toothed cats prowl the twilight, their eyes reflecting the faint light of the moon, waiting for the stragglers of the human pack to lose their way. The night belongs to the claws and the teeth, an arena where speed and muscle dictate the right to see the dawn. Leopards drag human prey up into the branches of acacia trees, leaving the survivors to huddle closer to the flickering embers of their fires. In a world populated by titans, humans exist as small, fragile specks of flesh and bone. They trace the shapes of footprints in the dirt, calculating the weight and direction of the beasts sharing their water sources. They lack the thick hides of the rhinos and the crushing jaws of the cats, relying instead on a fragile awareness of their surroundings. Every broken twig and every sudden silence in the insect chorus serves as a warning of approaching death. We don't realize the magnitude of their vulnerability, standing on the shoulders of their survival. They endure the jaws of predators and the ravages of a shifting climate, preserving the fragile flame of humanity against impossible odds. The physical battle for survival demands every ounce of their energy, leaving little room for the luxuries of invention. Yet hidden beneath the sweat and the fear, a mystery waits inside the confines of their skulls, a puzzle challenging everything we know about the origins of the mind. A spark catches the dry tinder. The flames rise, illuminating the faces of the band sitting in the dust. They possess fire, hand axes, and scrapers meant to strip the meat from bone. The rough texture of the unworked stone presses into their palms, absorbing the sweat and dirt of the journey. They show a capacity for empathy, binding the wounds of the injured and offering portions of food to the elderly members of the tribe who can no longer hunt. They construct temporary shelters from branches and hides to block the wind. But the artifacts they leave behind tell a story of vanishing clusters of innovation, brief flashes of brilliance fading back into the dark. They navigate the landscape with a calculating intelligence, mapping the seasons and the migrations of the herds, yet they leave no paintings on the walls, no carvings in the bone, no monuments to their existence. Watch the hands of an ancient human resting by the fire, holding a piece of raw flint. The stone strikes the core, sending a sharp, percussive crack echoing against the walls of a cliff. The rhythmic, deliberate striking continues, shaving away the flakes to reveal a sharp edge. The hands executing this task connect to eyes tracking the exact angle of the fracture, guided by a brain indistinguishable from the one sitting inside your own head right now. The hardware matches ours. The ridges, the lobes, the capacity for memory and complex thought remain identical across the chasm of time. You can't look at their skulls without confronting the behavioral modernity problem, a paradox defying the steady march of progress. The potential locked inside that ancient skull defies logic. The grey matter resting beneath the bone houses the capacity to dream of distant galaxies, to compose symphonies layering strings and brass, and to split the atom. If you took a child born 250,000 years ago, transported them across the fabric of time, and raised them in a modern home, they would blend into our world without a trace. That child could learn to read the symbols on a page, grasp the intricate rules of calculus, and argue the nuances of politics in a crowded room. They possess the exact same cognitive machinery we use to build skyscrapers and map the human genome. Yet, in their own time, they sit by the fire, staring into the flames, content to chip the same piece of stone their ancestors chipped 1,000 generations before. It's a haunting realization. The mind capable of engineering rockets spends its days scraping marrow from the bones of scavenged antelope, trapped in a loop of survival. We don't understand the lock holding back their potential. If the biological hardware stood ready and fully developed, waiting in the shadows of the skull, what kind of environmental shock was required to upgrade the software of the human mind? The timeline marches forward, bringing us to a moment of catastrophic rupture 74,000 years ago. The Earth tears open in the region we now call Indonesia. Mount Toba erupts, sending a column of fire and rock tearing through the atmosphere, shattering the quiet rhythms of the planet. The explosion expels unimaginable volumes of sulfur and pulverized stone into the air, creating a dense curtain blocking the warmth of the sun. The sky turns the color of bruised iron. A muffled, suffocating sound of endless falling ash blankets the landscape, burying the forests and choking the rivers. The ash falls like a heavy snow, coating the leaves and snapping the branches under its immense weight. The rivers run thick with grey sludge, poisoning the water sources and suffocating the fish beneath the surface. The green canopy turns grey, and a sudden chill grips the continents, plunging the Earth into a volcanic winter lasting for years, perhaps decades. The temperature plunges, dropping by an average of 15 degrees Celsius across the globe. The sudden freeze catches the world unprepared, turning the vibrant hunting grounds into desolate expanses of frost and dying vegetation. The herds of megafauna starve, their massive frames collapsing into the snow, taking the primary food source of our ancestors down with them. The cold creeps into the bones of the human bands scattered across Africa and Asia. They retreat into the depths of caves, watching the endless snow and ash fall across the horizons, realizing the earth has turned against them. The struggle shifts from avoiding the claws of predators to fighting the invisible, suffocating grip of the freezing air. The survivors huddle together, sharing the fading warmth of their bodies, listening to the wind howling through the canyons. This catastrophe leaves a permanent scar etched into the microscopic structures of your very own cells. The genetic record written in modern DNA reveals an extreme bottleneck, a narrowing of the human lineage bringing the species to the absolute brink of annihilation. The math tells a story of profound terror. The global breeding population collapses, leaving a mere 3,000 to 10,000 individuals wandering the fractured, freezing landscapes. Think of a small rural town, holding the entirety of human existence within its borders. 10,000 humans scattered across the vastness of the continents, isolated by rivers of ice and mountains of ash. They face a loneliness defying comprehension, cut off from neighbouring tribes, forced to scavenge for roots hidden beneath the frozen soil. We don't often recognise how close the story came to ending in the dark. It's a miracle anyone survived the ash and the ice. You can't separate our modern resilience from the trauma of that long winter. Facing the precipice of extinction, the survivors endure a crucible forcing the collective psychology of the species to adapt or perish, rewiring their minds for a world demanding a new way to live. The timeline weaves through the shadows, drawing us toward the southern edges of Africa, 77,000 years ago. Here, the sheer cliffs of Blombos Cave overlook the vast rhythmic swelling of the Indian Ocean. The salt hangs in the air, mixing with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. The waves crash against the rocks below, sending a steady, hypnotic roar echoing through the chambers of the cave. Inside the warmth of the rock shelter, away from the cutting winds of the coast, a human figure sits by the fire holding a piece of red ochre. The gentle, deliberate, sandy scraping of a stone tool carving into the soft pigment breaks the silence of the cave. The artist works with a focused intensity, bringing forth a design holding zero survival function in the fight against the wild. The stone point scratches geometric, cross-hatched lines into the surface of the ochre, forming a series of diamonds repeating across the flat edge of the rock. The sunlight catches the red dust coating the fingers of the artist, turning their hands the colour of rust and blood. The dust falls away, revealing a pattern born solely from the imagination. This small block of pigment offers no edge for cutting meat, no point for piercing a hide, and no spark to start a fire. The artist blows the excess dust from the surface, revealing the sharp intersections of the lines. The diamonds lock together, an intentional geometry carved into a chaotic world. You can't eat the pattern, and it won't shield you from the cold, but it represents an earthquake in the history of the mind. It is the birth of pure abstract art, a deliberate signalling of symbolism stepping into the physical world. We don't fully comprehend the shift required to make this leap. For hundreds of thousands of years, every tool served a physical need. Now, a mind looks at a blank surface and decides to assign an arbitrary meaning to the stone. The cross-hatched diamonds might represent the scales of a fish, the weaving of a basket, or the concept of the tribe itself, but the specific meaning matters less than the act of creation. It's the first time a human brain projects an internal thought onto an external object, demanding the world hold the shape of its ideas. Once a mind realizes it can force meaning into a silent stone, the boundaries of reality begin to bend. If they can invent symbols in the shadows of the cave, what other invisible architectures can they construct? The revolution of the mind continues to unfold along the coast. The inhabitants of Blombos do more than scratch patterns into pigment. They begin to adorn their own bodies, changing the way they present themselves to the world. They gather tiny shells from the estuary, selecting specific shapes and sizes, and carefully drill holes through the hard calcium enclosures. The delicate, hollow clinking of the tiny seashells threading onto a dried cord of animal sinew introduces a new sound to the human experience. It's the sound of identity taking a physical form, the rustling of ornaments worn not for warmth, but for the eyes of others. The effort required to create these necklaces demands hours of meticulous, unnecessary labour. They use precisely shaped awls and points, carved from bone at the nearby border cave, to pierce the shells without shattering the fragile domes. The fingers of the maker hold the shell steady against a piece of wood, applying just enough pressure to the bone awl, feeling the sudden release as the point breaks through the surface. The friction from the cord smooths the edges of the holes over time, leaving a polished surface, proving these beads hang around the necks of the wearers for years. They mix the crushed red ochre pigment with animal fat and plant resins, storing the vibrant paste inside the hollow bowls of larger shells, creating the world's first paint kits. The red paste inside the abalone shell catches the firelight, a vibrant mixture of crushed earth and rendered marrow, waiting to trace the lines of a hunt across the face of a warrior. You won't find this behaviour in any other creature walking the earth. We don't see mere decoration in these drilled shells. We see the ability to imagine futures, to tell stories, and to signal belonging to a larger tribe. The necklace communicates status and memory, carrying the weight of social bonds visible from across the glow of the firelight. When a person paints their skin with the stored red pigment and wears the shells from the sea, they declare their existence and their place within the group. It's a complex language of symbols speaking without a single sound. Yet, a shadow haunts this awakening. If these sparks of genius existed along the southern coast, burning so bright in the archaeological record, why do they vanish and reappear across the millennia like ghosts caught in a storm? The timeline of human progress refuses to follow a straight path. Instead of a steady climb toward mastery, the archaeological record reveals a frustrating pattern of fits and starts, a flickering candle struggling to stay lit in a drafty room. We find layers of earth hiding sophisticated tools crafted 90,000 years ago, complex blades and scrapers suggesting a mastery of the stone, only to dig higher and find nothing but silence for the next 20,000 years. The brilliant inventions disappear, swallowed by the relentless passage of time and death. Listen to the sweeping rush of the wind tearing across the dunes, the sound of nature erasing footprints in the sand, symbolizing the devastating loss of generational knowledge. These ancient humans live in small, fragmented populations, constantly moving under the immense pressure of a shifting climate and roaming predators. When a band consists of only 30 individuals, the survival of an idea balances on the edge of a knife. The elders hold the secrets of the tribe, memorizing the specific angle required to drill a shell or the exact mixture of fat and ochre needed to bind the pigment. If a sudden winter or a vicious predator claims the lives of those key individuals, the knowledge dies with them. The tribe forgets how to make the advanced tools, slipping backward into the simplicity of their ancestors. You can't examine this pattern without confronting the cultural ratchet problem. A ratchet allows a gear to turn forward while preventing it from slipping back, locking the progress in place. But the ancient human world lacks this crucial mechanism. A sudden population crash acts as a catastrophic shock, erasing the hard drive of human culture and forcing the survivors to start over from the beginning. We don't realize how fragile the chain of memory truly is when it relies solely on the spoken word and the demonstration of the hands. The brilliant sparks of innovation fade into the dark, unable to catch the dry wood of the broader world. It raises a haunting question for those walking the plains. What does it take to make memory permanent, extending the life of an idea beyond the final breath of a single elder? The shifting sands of time reveal a quiet revolution in the shadows of the border cave. The struggle for survival pauses, making room for an act carrying profound philosophical weight. A small group gathers in the dim light of the rock shelter, their faces painted with the sorrow of a sudden loss. They dig a small grave into the dirt floor, working the soil until it forms a resting place for an infant who did not survive the harsh realities of the ancient world. The soft, reverent patting of earth over the small body echoes through the chamber, a gentle sound cutting through the endless noise of the wilderness. They place a single, perforated shell ornament inside the grave, a deliberate offering accompanying the child into the dark. This intentional burial practice signifies a monumental shift in the architecture of the mind. The human brain looks upon the motionless body and refuses to accept the biological cessation of life as the absolute end of the story. They don't abandon the fallen to the scavengers. They invest time and energy to hide the remains beneath the earth, protecting the physical form from the elements. The inclusion of the shell ornament proves the existence of a belief stretching beyond the visible world. It's a token meant for a journey the living can't see, a physical anchor for the concepts of memory, identity, and the enduring nature of the spirit. We won't ever know the exact words whispered over the soil, or the specific shape of the soul they imagined departing the body, but the grave itself stands as a monument to self-awareness. To bury the dead is to understand the concept of time, to look at the cold flesh and recognize the inevitability of one's own ending. The birth of spirituality blooms from the realization of mortality. They place the dirt over the child, smoothing the surface with their palms, creating a boundary between the world of the breathing and the realm of the ancestors. Having confronted the reality of death, and having constructed a second world in their minds where the spirit continues to walk, where would these newly self-aware humans go next as they turn their faces toward the horizon? The timeline pushes forward to 70,000 years ago, tracing the long shadow cast by the eruption of Toba. The suffocating winter eventually loosens its grip on the continents, allowing a slow, hesitant warming to thaw the ice and restore the rhythm of the seasons. The East African grasslands expand, rolling like green oceans under the returning strength of the sun. The herds of grazing animals multiply, tracing the blooming vegetation and pulling the human hunters along the winding paths of the valleys. A restless momentum takes hold of the human bands, an instinct driving them to walk beyond the familiar ridges and seek the unknown edges of the earth. They begin a relentless, slow-motion migration out of the ancestral homeland, following the promises of the shifting climate toward the gates of a wider world. They cross the narrow, treacherous straits of the southern Red Sea, navigating the treacherous currents where the water meets the sky, and push through the sandy corridors of the Sinai Peninsula, stepping into the dust of the Middle East. They don't plunge blindly into the deep hostile interiors of the unknown continents. Instead, they find a continuous highway providing everything they need to sustain the march. They follow the coastal route tracing the long curving edge of the Arabian Peninsula, walking the boundary between the scorching deserts and the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean rim. The rhythmic splashing of the waves breaking against the rocks sets the tempo for their journey, a steady, hypnotic beat carrying them across thousands of miles of virgin sand. The crunching of discarded seashells underfoot marks the passage of generations, leaving a trail of white fragments gleaming in the moonlight. This coastal path serves as an endless buffet, allowing the bands to migrate rapidly across the globe without the burden of reinventing their survival strategies in unfamiliar forests or frozen tundras. The ocean offers a reliable, unchanging menu regardless of the longitude. They learn to harvest the wealth of the tidal pools, prying open the stubborn shells of oysters and clams, their fingers stained with the salty brine of the sea. They spear the silver flashes of fish trapped in the shallows during the low tide, and they scale the jagged cliffs to raid the nests of seabirds, collecting the eggs and the rich meat of the winged hunters. You can't overstate the efficiency of this marine diet, providing a steady stream of fat and protein fueling the expansion of the human brain while ensuring the bellies of the children remain full, the salt crusts on their skin, a physical reminder of their deep connection to the water. The coastal highway strips away the terror of the unknown, transforming the daunting prospect of a global migration into a manageable series of daily walks along the surf. They leave the towering mountains and the dense predator-filled jungles to the left, keeping the safety of the open water to their right. The rhythm of the tides becomes their clock, dictating the hours of the hunt and the moments of rest. You won't find a faster method of crossing the ancient world than walking the line where the sand meets the sea. They multiply along the shores, spreading their campsites across the bays and the river mouths, leaving mounds of hollow shells as the only monuments to their passing. It's a quiet conquest of the earth, achieved not through the violence of armies, but through the slow, undeniable accumulation of footsteps along the beaches of antiquity. Their eyes trace the flight of the gulls, wondering what shores lie hidden beyond the curvature of the blue expanse. Walking the edge of the world, following the reliable harvest of the shallows, how did they confront the ultimate barrier of the open ocean when the solid ground finally dissolved into the deep? The restless push along the coasts carries the human bands deep into the tropical heat of Southeast Asia by 70,000 years ago. The beaches stretch through dense archipelagos, fracturing the solid ground into a puzzle of islands scattered across the shimmering water. The journey east eventually brings them to a staggering halt at the edge of the Sunda Shelf. Beyond the final beaches, a terrifying expanse of deep, dark water separates the familiar islands from the isolated continent of Australia. The distance demands a crossing of over 50 to 60 miles of open ocean, a void offering no land bridge, no shallow wading pools, and no safety net for the weak. Listen to the deep, hollow swelling of the dark open ocean lifting a small vessel, accompanied by the strained, agonizing creaking of lashed wood bending against the immense power of the currents. You can't reach the distant shores of Australia by accident. The journey requires a profound leap in technology and collective courage. The ocean currents tear through the deep channels, threatening to drag any floating debris out into the infinite expanse of the sea, where dehydration and exposure guarantee a silent death. To cross this barrier, the ancient mariners construct actual boats, binding logs and thick bamboo together with heavy vines, sealing the gaps with plant resins to fight the inevitable leaks. They don't just build a raft for a single hunter, they engineer vessels capable of carrying entire families, heavy supplies of food, and the most critical cargo of all, fresh water sealed in animal skins or hollow gourds. The logistics of the crossing demand a level of planning pushing the limits of the Paleolithic mind. The departure from the safety of the shore marks a moment of unimaginable bravery. They push the heavy wooden hulls into the surf, feeling the sudden, weightless drop as the floor of the ocean falls away beneath them. The land fades into a thin line on the horizon, leaving them surrounded by a perfect circle of water. The navigators read the stars, memorizing the patterns of the night sky to hold their course, while watching the subtle shifts in the wind and the migration of the seabirds to predict the weather. It's a high-stakes gamble relying completely on the coordination of the group, pulling the oars in unison, bailing the dark water from the bottom of the boat, and trusting the integrity of the vines holding their world together. The sun beats down on the open decks, cracking the lips of the rowers and testing the limits of their endurance. The salt sprays across their faces, stinging their eyes as they scan the horizon for the faint, hazy outline of mountains. They calculate the drift of the currents, making constant adjustments to the angle of the prow, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of fluid dynamics without a single written equation. The nights on the water bring a suffocating darkness, illuminated only by the cold fire of the constellations reflecting off the black swells. You don't make this journey without an unshakable belief in the destination, a shared vision holding the terrified crew together when the waves threaten to capsize the fragile craft. The sheer audacity of looking at a deadly expanse of water and deciding to build a machine to conquer it separates these ancestors from every other creature on the planet. They master the art of tying knots, the science of buoyancy, and the psychology of leadership in a crisis. The ocean ceases to act as a wall and transforms into a highway, unlocking the deepest corners of the globe for the wandering mind. When the hulls finally scrape against the white sands of the new continent 65,000 years ago, the survivors step onto a landmass isolated from the rest of the world for millions of years. We won't find the remains of their wooden boats, long since consumed by the rot of the sea, but the presence of human footprints in the Australian dust serves as the ultimate proof of their maritime mastery. Arriving in these new lands, covered in the salt of the crossing, they stood victorious over the elements, yet they found they weren't the only humans walking the surface of the earth. The expansion out of Africa pushes the wandering bands north into the cooler, unforgiving climates of Europe and Western Asia. The migrating humans step into the valleys and forests, seeking shelter from the biting winds, only to realize the caves are already occupied. They encounter the Neanderthals, a thick-boned, powerfully built species of humanity adapted to the bitter cold of the northern latitudes. Further east, in the shadows of the Asian mountains, they meet the Denisovans, another branch of the human family tree holding the high ground. Listen to the sharp, snapping crackle of a shared campfire cutting through the twilight, accompanied by the low, murmuring exchange of two distinctly different types of human voices echoing against the stone walls. It's an intimate, tense atmosphere of discovery, two long-lost cousins meeting across the glow of the embers. We don't look at this encounter through the lens of a sudden apocalyptic war. The reality painted by the archaeological sites in the Middle East and Europe shows a complex, nuanced overlapping of territories stretching for thousands of years. The camps reveal mixed tool technologies, the heavy, robust scrapers of the Neanderthals resting beside the lighter, sharper blades of the newcomers. They watch each other from the ridges, studying the hunting techniques of the strangers, eventually closing the distance to trade hides, meat, and the secrets of the landscape. The physical differences stand out in the flickering light. The Neanderthals possess heavy brow ridges, wide noses designed to warm the freezing air, and barrel-shaped chests housing massive lungs. The newly arrived humans look slender and fragile by comparison, relying on their numbers and their rapid communication to secure their place in the valley. They share the meat of the hunt, tearing the roasted flesh from the bones, communicating through a makeshift language of gestures and mimicry. The tension of the early meeting slowly dissolves into the practical necessity of survival, leading to alliances against the crushing winter storms. The initial fear gives way to curiosity, leading to an entanglement altering the genetic destiny of the species forever. The proof of this intimacy doesn't rely on scattered bones. It lives inside the cells of almost every person walking the earth today. The genetic sequencing of ancient fossils confirms the undeniable truth of interbreeding. Modern humans descending from populations outside of Africa carry roughly 2% Neanderthal DNA woven directly into their chromosomes. The Denisovans also leave their genetic signature, passing down crucial adaptations allowing the descendants to survive the thin, suffocating air of the highest mountain plateaus. You can't deny the profound connection forged in the ice and the snow. The lineages merge, absorbing the immune system strengths and the cold weather resilience of the native populations, creating a hybrid strength carrying humanity forward. Yet, a haunting question lingers over the shared fires. Despite spreading across the entire globe, mastering the oceans and exchanging blood with other human species, why did the overall pace of technological change still remain so agonizingly slow, trapped in the rhythm of the stone? The climate turns against the fragile alliances of humanity, plunging the northern hemisphere into the brutal depths of a deep glacial freeze. Massive ice sheets, towering a full mile thick, scrape across the bedrock of northern Europe and Siberia, crushing the forests and trapping the moisture of the world in frozen monuments. The advancing ice creates the Mammoth Steppe, a vast, unbroken, treeless tundra prairie stretching from the coasts of France all the way to the distant plains of Mongolia. The wind howls across the flat expanse, finding no obstacles to break its momentum, carrying a biting frost freezing the moisture inside the lungs. Listen to the heavy, rhythmic crunch of boots wrapped in animal hides pressing into the deep snow, followed by the distant thunderous footfalls of mammoth herds shaking the frozen ground with the weight of mountains. The scale of the beasts roaming this glittering pale landscape defies the modern imagination. The mammoths push through the snowdrifts, their massive curved tusks sweeping the frost away to uncover the sparse dry grasses hidden beneath. Woolly rhinoceroses lower their heads against the blizzard, their thick coats of hair shielding them from the deadly drop in temperature. Giant elk carry antlers spanning the width of a small river, navigating the frozen marshes beside wild horses, herds of massive bison and reindeer migrating across the endless white plains. The predators of the ice, the cave lions and the desperate packs of wolves, shadow the migrations, leaving trails of blood freezing instantly against the ice. The humans inhabiting this unforgiving world wrap themselves in the heavy skins of the fallen beasts, stitching the hides together to create a barrier against the killing cold. They hold simple, heavy-thrusting spears, weapons requiring the hunter to close the distance and strike the giant prey by hand, risking the crushing weight of hooves and the lethal sweep of horns. The Ice Age sky burns with a pale, cold light, casting long blue shadows across the undulating drifts of snow. The landscape offers no place to hide, forcing the hunters to use the contours of the terrain, creeping through the shallow ravines to avoid the sharp eyes of the herd. The simple thrusting spear represents a deadly game of mathematics, calculating the exact moment to strike the vital organs before the mammoth can turn and crush the fragile human body into the permafrost. The sheer physical toll of existing in this freezer breaks the weak, demanding a caloric intake forcing the bands to hunt constantly, leaving no time for rest. You don't survive the Mammoth Steppe without a relentless, brutal endurance, a willingness to face the absolute extreme of the Earth's hostility. They are trapped in a frozen world, a claustrophobic existence bound by the ice and the migrations of the meat. Standing in the shadow of the glaciers, shivering beneath the furs, What profound internal shift would finally break the technological gridlock and give these hunters the power to conquer the giants of the steppe? Between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago, the stagnation of the Paleolithic era shatters. An invisible threshold is crossed, triggering the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, a sudden explosive acceleration of the human mind. The gears of intellect finally catch, locking into place and spinning with a terrifying new momentum. The simple, heavy hand axes vanish, replaced by specialized, intricate toolkits, demonstrating a mastery of physics and material science. Listen to the sharp, precise snapping and carving of bone against stone, followed by the sudden, violent whoosh of an atlatl dart cutting the air, striking a target with lethal accuracy before the prey even registers the sound. They don't just hit rocks together anymore, they engineer composite systems. They strike long, razor-sharp blades from prepared cores of flint, attaching the sharp stone to wooden handles using heated plant resins and tight bindings of sinew. The hunters run their thumbs along the edge of the freshly struck flint blades, feeling a sharpness rivaling modern steel, a cutting edge capable of slicing through the thickest hides with minimal effort. The careful application of the sinew bindings demonstrates an understanding of tension and shrinkage as the wet animal fibers dry and contract, locking the stone points into the wooden shafts with an unbreakable grip. The creation of bone and antler needles, complete with carefully drilled eyes, allows the humans to tailor their clothing, stitching tight, weatherproof seams trapping the heat against the skin. They carve delicate fishing hooks to pull protein from the freezing rivers, expanding their diet beyond the dangerous pursuit of the megafauna. It's a paradigm shift from using a single piece of material to combining multiple elements to achieve a specific, complex function. You can't look at these tools without seeing the birth of modern engineering. The mind no longer reacts to the environment. It actively deconstructs the problems of survival and builds mechanical solutions. The needles pull the thread through the tough leather, sealing the gaps and transforming crude animal skins into sophisticated, fitted garments shielding the hunters from the fatal drops in temperature. The invention of the spear thrower, the atlatl, changes the fundamental mechanics of the hunt. By creating an artificial extension of the human arm, the hunters use the leverage of the carved wood to launch flexible darts at lethal, unprecedented speeds, multiplying the force of the muscles. The weapon strikes the mammoths and the bison from a safe distance, removing the need to face the crushing hooves in close combat. The early prototypes of bows and arrows appear, storing the kinetic energy of the drawn string to deliver silent death from the shadows of the tree line. The humans transform into the undisputed apex predators of the world, utilizing the science of ballistics to dominate the food chain. As hunting transforms from a desperate, high-risk physical struggle into a calculated science, the bands find themselves with full stomachs and hours of free time. What did they do with the massive mental surplus they had suddenly unlocked in the depths of the Ice Age? The newly acquired surplus of time drives the human mind underground, seeking the quiet isolation of the deep earth. 36,000 years ago, a group of artists enters the Chauvet Cave in the south of France, leaving the howling winds of the glacial winter behind. They walk past the twilight zone of the entrance, descending into a realm of absolute crushing darkness, where the light of the sun has never touched the stone. Listen to the sputtering, popping sizzle of burning animal fat pooling inside a carved stone lamp, casting a flickering, hallucinatory glow against the damp, undulating walls of the cave. The soft, deliberate smudging of pigment against the cold rock creates a bridge between the physical world and the realm of dreams. The artists do not paint crude, rigid stick figures. They apply the carefully ground pigments with a breathtaking, sophisticated mastery of perspective and anatomy. The flickering light reveals stampeding herds of wild horses, the heavy, muscular shoulders of the aurochs, and the terrifying, silent stalking of the cave lions. They use the natural curves and bulges of the cave wall to give the animals three-dimensional volume, overlapping the legs and shading the bellies with crushed charcoal to create the illusion of frantic motion. The smell of the burning marrow mixes with the rich metallic scent of the damp earth, creating an atmosphere of heavy, hypnotic reverence. The artist stands on the tips of their toes, reaching high above their head, dragging a piece of charred wood across the limestone to trace the curve of a lion's back. They blend the harsh lines with the pads of their thumbs, softening the edges to mimic the thick fur of the beasts they hunt in the waking world. When the torchlight dances across the walls, the beasts appear to breathe, their muscles rippling in the shadows, trapped in a permanent silent stampede across the stone. The silence of the deep cave amplifies the sound of their breathing, isolating the mind from the endless struggle of the steppe. The darkness acts as a blank slate, stripping away the distractions of the survival cycle and allowing the imagination to project its fears and reverences directly onto the stone. We don't know the specific rituals performed in these subterranean galleries, but the intent is undeniable. Over the centuries, generations return to caves like Lascaux and Altamira, layering new paintings over the old, adding the outlines of rhinos and the majestic sweep of mammoth tusks to the sacred canvas. They chew the red ochre and spit the pigment over their hands, leaving negative silhouettes of their fingers permanently stamped into the rock, a haunting signature declaring their presence to the future. You can't stand beneath these painted ceilings without feeling the overwhelming power of a mind attempting to capture the soul of the wild. It's a profound leap in cognitive ability, freezing time and space within the borders of a drawing. These majestic, silent herds represent a desperate communication across time, leaving messages for the descendants who will walk the caves thousands of years later. But how did they communicate these complex ideas across the vast physical space of the continents? The explosion of artistic expression refuses to remain confined to the dark, hidden chambers of the deep caves. It spills out into the light, transforming into portable art carried across the vast expanse of Ice Age Europe, stretching from the valleys of France all the way to the frozen plains of Russia. The hands of the hunters shape small, enigmatic objects, creating the famous Venus figurines from chunks of mammoth ivory, soft stone, and even baked clay. Listen to the smooth, heavy, polished feeling of a small carved ivory figure turning over in the palm of a hand, the surface worn shiny by the oils of the skin and the endless miles of the journey. It's an intensely personal connection to a shared mythology, carried in a leather pouch resting against the chest. The creation of these portable artifacts demands a meticulous, patient hand, shaving the tough mammoth tusk with sharp flint blades until the smooth curves emerge from the bone. The figurines feature exaggerated breasts and wide hips, celebrating the curves of fertility and the sustaining power of the female form in a world defined by starvation and cold. The faces remain featureless, lacking eyes or mouths, transforming the carvings from representations of specific individuals into universal symbols of life and survival. The figurines rest with a comforting weight in the hand, offering a tactile comfort to the traveller facing the howling winds of the mammoth steppe. They don't just carve the human form. The camps produce intricately engraved bone plaques, animal teeth drilled to hang as pendants, and delicate seashell beads discovered hundreds of miles inland, far away from any ocean shore. You can't explain the presence of marine shells in the deep interior of the continent without acknowledging the existence of massive continent-wide trade networks. The inland discovery of the seashells reveals a complex web of social obligations, a system of gifts and alliances preventing the isolated bands from turning against one another when the herds migrate out of reach. The exchange of these small treasures proves the scattered, isolated bands of humans are no longer wandering blindly. They maintain contact with neighbouring tribes, passing the shells, the ivory, and the flint tools across vast distances, hand to hand, from the coasts to the mountains. The hunters recognize the shared symbols, seeing the familiar shape of the Venus in the hands of a stranger, instantly establishing a common ground of belief. The Venus figurines demonstrate a shared religious or mythological world, an invisible thread of belief connecting strangers across thousands of miles of hostile tundra. We don't see mere bartering for meat. We see the trade of symbols, the exchange of ideas, and the formation of a collective pan-European culture uniting the species against the ice. To trade these complex symbols and coordinate the transfer of goods across such staggering distances, relying on the cooperation of countless different tribes, what ultimate invisible tool was required to bind their minds together? Listen to the low, rhythmic murmur of a complex story passing from the lips of an elder into the warm, smoke-filled air. The sounds blend into a hypnotic drone, wrapping the listeners in a shared, invisible world constructed entirely of breath and vibration. The bones of the earth preserve the stones and the drilled shells, but modern language doesn't fossilize, leaving no physical trace in the dirt for us to uncover. We can't dig up the echoes of the first true sentences, yet the evidence of their existence surrounds the ancient fires. The leap from simple grunts and pointing fingers to the boundless architecture of complex syntax represents the ultimate crossing of the threshold. To coordinate a hunt across a sprawling valley, anticipating the movements of a mammoth herd and directing the spear throwers to their precise ambush points, hunters need more than gestures. They need a system of communication capable of discussing the future and the unseen. They share the intricate mechanics of their survival, teaching the exact pressure required to strike a flint blade, or the delicate knots holding a snare together, using a flexible grammar, allowing them to fold ideas inside of other ideas. This power of recursion, the ability to weave a thought within a thought, unlocks the limitless potential of the human mind. The spoken words build invisible structures in the dark, bridging the space between isolated minds and forging a collective consciousness extending far beyond the reach of the firelight. A hunter sits on the damp earth, drawing a map in the dust with a stick, using words to paint the terrain of a mountain pass they won't cross until the snows melt. It's an act of pure magic, summoning places and events out of thin air, forcing the minds of the listeners to visualize a reality existing only in the realm of imagination. The complexity of this invisible architecture ties directly to the survival of the species and the permanent locking of the cultural ratchet. In the past, the tragic death of a skilled elder meant the permanent loss of a crucial technology, plunging the tribe backward into the shadows. Now, the population densities cross a critical threshold, clustering together in larger networks across the landscape. The sheer number of voices echoing in the camps creates a redundant, fail-safe system for the storage of knowledge. If one elder falls to the claws of a predator, the songs and the stories survive in the memories of the youths who sat and listened to the rhythmic chanting. The data secures itself within the collective memory of the group, ensuring the hard-won secrets of the stone and the bone outlive the fragile flesh of the inventors. You can't overstate the sheer force generated by this shared database of knowledge. The humans exchange the names of distant trading partners, memorizing the alliances and the debts stretching across thousands of miles of frozen tundra and dense forests. They encode the migrations of the stars and the changing of the seasons into myths and legends, packaging vital survival data within the captivating shell of a narrative. Armed with this recursive language, sophisticated art, and deadly composite weapons, these humans transform into a superorganism, moving across the plains with a synchronized purpose. The scattered bands operate with the lethal efficiency of a unified pack, their minds linked by the invisible threads of syntax and shared belief. What impact would this newly evolved apex predator, wielding the power of complex thought and coordinated action, have on the ancient giants wandering the unsuspecting earth? The arrival of the unified human hunters leaves a permanent, devastating scar across the continents. Trace the journey to the isolated expanse of Australia around 50,000 years ago. The ancestors step onto the shores of a world frozen in a bizarre, ancient equilibrium, walking among creatures defying the logic of the northern lands. Giant kangaroos, towering over the heads of the new arrivals, bound across the red dirt. Massive flightless birds stalk through the brush, and megalania reptiles, lizards the size of small rivers, drag their scaled bellies through the dust. Then the silence of the outback shatters. Listen to the heavy, lonely thud of a massive beast collapsing to the earth, a sound vibrating through the soles of your feet, followed by an eerie, unnatural quiet settling over the plains. Within a blink of geological time, 90% of the land mammals weighing over 200 pounds disappear into the void, leaving nothing but their bleached bones baking in the sun. The tragedy repeats itself as the descendants cross into the Americas between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago. They navigate the shrinking ice corridors and step into a hemisphere teeming with titans. Mammoths and mastodons strip the bark from the trees, while glyptodons roam the valleys like armoured tanks covered in impenetrable domes of bone. Giant beavers construct dams turning rivers into vast lakes. Yet, wherever the footprint of the human hunter appears, the shadows of the giants fade. The archaeological record shows a wave of extinction sweeping from the northern tundras down to the southern tip of the world. The massive beasts vanish, erased from the valleys and the forests, leaving an empty silence in their wake. We can't ignore the debate raging over the cause of this great dying. The Earth undergoes massive climate shifts, specifically the sharp glacial swings of the younger Dryas, placing immense stress on the delicate food webs of the megafauna. The changing temperatures shrink the grasslands and disrupt the ancient breeding cycles, pushing the giant herbivores to the edge of starvation. But the climate alone doesn't strike the fatal blow. The sudden introduction of the human overkill package, the synchronized ambushes, the lethal speed of the spear throwers, and the relentless tracking driven by complex language, pushes the struggling populations over the cliff. The hunters harvest the slow-breeding giants faster than the herds can replace their fallen calves. The coordination of the human bands acts as an unstoppable force, stripping the valleys of their ancient guardians and reshaping the ecological balance of the planet. It's a melancholic, tragic realization. Tragic. The humans secure their survival by thinning the ranks of the animal kingdom, casting themselves as the undisputed masters of the earth. We don't just consume the flesh of the beasts, we consume the diversity of the landscape itself. As the world's megafauna fade away like ghosts swallowed by the mist, an unsettling question emerges from the empty plains. We outlasted the mammoths and the giant kangaroos, but what happened to the other branches of our own human family tree who shared the ice and the caves? The slow march of time brings a chilling finality to the competing branches of humanity. The Neanderthals, the resilient survivors of the glacial cold, vanish from the earth around 40,000 years ago. Their final refuges shrink to the isolated caves of southern Spain and the distant corners of the Near East, holding the fading embers of a culture stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. The Denisovans meet a similar fate, dissolving into the vast, silent expanses of the Asian continent. Listen to the solitary, fading echo of a Neanderthal tool strike ringing against a stone wall, the sound slowly swallowed by the wind creeping through the valley until only an unbroken silence remains. It isn't a cinematic war filled with charging armies and burning forests. It's a slow, haunting fade to black, a quiet, tragic surrender to the shifting mechanics of the world. The descendants of the African migrants don't exterminate their cousins through sheer violence. They simply outcompete them on the margins of survival. Homo sapiens deploy broader, more flexible diets, pulling fish from the freezing rivers, trapping small game in the brush, and harvesting the tough roots hidden beneath the frost. When the climate fluctuates and the large game disappears, the Neanderthals, trapped in their specialized reliance on the megafauna, find themselves staring at empty horizons. The modern humans leverage their larger, interconnected social networks, passing resources and information across vast trading routes. A Sapiens band facing starvation receives dried meat and pelts from allies living 3 valleys away, while an isolated Neanderthal family faces the winter alone, relying solely on the strength of their immediate kin. The rapid pace of Sapiens innovation, the constant refinement of the needles and the projectile weapons, creates an efficiency gap the ancient cousins can't close. The Neanderthals possess brilliant minds and deep emotions, burying their dead and caring for their sick, but their smaller populations lack the density to sustain the cultural ratchet. Their brilliant inventions flicker and die out in the isolation of the frozen caves. The final generations don't end in a grand battle. They simply fail to replace their numbers, the birth rates dropping below the threshold of survival as the hunting grounds yield less and less meat. The genetic absorption acts as a final testament to their existence. The Neanderthals don't vanish entirely. They merge into the expanding tide of the newcomers, gifting the vital genes for immunity and high-altitude survival to the descendants inheriting the Earth. The fire in their hearths burns down to ash, leaving Homo sapiens standing alone, the final, solitary iteration of a diverse family tree. It's an isolating triumph, standing on the empty plains without any peers to share the horizon, as the sole surviving humans walking a warming world, peering out over landscapes stripped of their ancient giants and rival minds. We were about to accidentally reinvent the Earth and lock ourselves into a new kind of prison. The immense weight of the Ice Age begins to lift from the shoulders of the continents. 20,000 years ago, the great glaciers retreat toward the poles, tearing massive gouges into the bedrock and releasing oceans of fresh water into the thirsty earth. The relentless cold loosens its grip, and the world breathes a sigh of relief. River valleys explode with new life, filling with lush stands of wild grains and offering sanctuary to the multiplying herds of grazing animals. The human bands follow the retreating frost, expanding their camps along the fertile riverbanks, enjoying an unprecedented bounty of wild wheat and easy prey. But the earth holds a terrifying secret in its shifting currents. 12,900 years ago, the warming abruptly stops, and the Younger Dryas shock hits the northern hemisphere like a physical blow. Listen to the sharp, sudden crack of freezing ice forming over a once-flowing river, a chilling reversal of spring turning the water to stone in the middle of the night. The temperatures plummet, throwing the world back into the freezing grip of a glacial twilight. The relief of the warming world is abruptly crushed by a 1,000-year freeze, creating a devastating whiplash for the tribes expecting an endless summer. The lush green corridors of the Levant wither, the wild grains dying on the stalk before the seeds can mature. The expanding human populations, grown accustomed to the easy harvest, suddenly find themselves staring at an empty, dying landscape. The panic sets in as the familiar hunting grounds turn into desolate expanses of frost. This sudden climate shock forces a desperate adaptation upon the semi-sedentary foragers living in the valleys. They can't simply pack their tents and migrate to greener pastures, because the freeze stretches across the entire region, turning the known world hostile. Facing starvation, they change their relationship with the earth. They stop wandering and begin to actively manage the wild plants clinging to the edges of the dying rivers. They gather the seeds of the wild grains, carrying them back to their camps in woven baskets, and intentionally scatter the kernels into the soft mud near the springs. It's a localized, desperate struggle against the cold, a realization that waiting for nature to provide means certain death. They guard the small patches of green, protecting the fragile stalks from the remaining grazing animals, linking their survival directly to the soil beneath their feet. The Younger Dryas punishes the Earth for over a millennium before finally breaking 11,700 years ago, allowing the climate to stabilize into the warm, predictable rhythms we recognize today. But the damage to the human psyche is permanent. The trauma of the freeze breaks the ancient cycle of wandering. In this desperate struggle against the unpredictable cold, rooting themselves to the mud of the riverbanks, they begin to build something defying all logic and rewriting the rules of human existence. The timeline stops at a stony ridge in the southeastern plains of modern-day Turkey, 11,600 years ago. The world is just beginning to thaw from the Younger Dryas, yet here, standing tall against the horizon, a monument defies every accepted rule of human progress. This is Göbekli Tepe. It isn't a city or a farming village. It's a massive, complex sanctuary built by people who still hunt wild game and gather wild roots. Listen to the deep, resonant, heavy grinding of massive stone pillars being hauled across the earth and set into the bedrock. The sheer physical effort required to move these stones vibrates in the air, the grunts of hundreds of workers echoing over the ridge as they pull the ropes woven from tough plant fibers. They carve the limestone into massive enclosures, forming perfect circles of towering T-shaped pillars weighing up to 20 tons each. These megaliths don't hold up a roof. They stand open to the sky, serving as physical anchors for a vast shared mythology. The craftsmen use flint tools to chisel intricate, terrifying symbols into the face of the stone, bringing a menagerie of predators out of the flat rock. They carve the snarling faces of foxes, the coiled, strike-ready forms of venomous snakes, the muscular bulk of wild boars, and the haunting, hunched figures of vultures. These aren't the gentle herds of prey painted in the ancient caves. These are the lethal, dangerous forces of nature, immortalized in stone by artists who refuse to yield to the wilderness. We look at these pillars and realize the entire timeline of civilization rests upside down. The old theories claim humanity invented farming first, generating a surplus of food, allowing the construction of temples and the birth of organized religion. Göbekli Tepe shatters that logic completely. The temple comes first. The desire to gather, to worship, and to build massive monuments to the unseen world acts as the primary catalyst. These are hunter-gatherers, people without a single domesticated crop, coordinating the labor of hundreds or thousands of individuals to carve a mountain into a sanctuary. It takes an unimaginable volume of meat and wild grain to feed the armies of stonecutters and laborers working on the ridge. The builders construct a mystical awe, raising impossible monuments, demanding constant maintenance and defense. The spiritual gravity of the site pulls the nomadic tribes out of their wandering loops, anchoring them to a specific point on the map. You can't maintain a monument of this scale without altering the way you feed the workers. If the profound human desire to worship and gather drove them to settle around these towering stones, how did they pull enough food from the wild to sustain the builders without starving in the shadow of the pillars? The answer lies in a slow, almost invisible transformation sweeping through the river valleys of the Fertile Crescent. To feed the gathering crowds, the humans cease to be mere consumers of the wild and transform into architects of genetics. It begins with a quiet, accidental intimacy, an altering of the destiny of the plants growing around their camps. Listen to the soft, dry rustle of wild wheat husks being rubbed between calloused fingers, the wind carrying the chaff away to leave the hard kernels resting in the palm. In the wild, a stalk of wheat survives by shattering, dropping its seeds to the ground at the slightest breeze to ensure the next generation takes root. The foragers sweeping through the fields naturally collect the mutant stalks refusing to shatter, the ones holding tightly to their seeds, because these are the only ones surviving the journey back to the processing stones. They scatter these non-shattering kernels around their settlements, unknowingly selecting a genetic trait forcing the plant to rely entirely on human hands for its reproduction. The wild wheat and the barley surrender their independence, binding their existence to the rhythm of the harvest. The humans do the same with lentils, peas and chickpeas, weeding out the aggressive wild variants and cultivating the compliant, predictable strains. The relationship extends beyond the soil, reaching into the herds roaming the edges of the valleys. The hunters stop killing the wild sheep and goats on sight. Instead, they capture the young, separating them from the herd and pulling them into the enclosures built from mud and thorns. Listen to the gentle, rhythmic bleating of a tame lamb standing inside a human-made pen, a sound replacing the terrifying roars of the ancient savanna. The herders practice a ruthless, calculated selection, culling the aggressive males bearing the massive, dangerous horns and keeping the tamer, docile individuals to breed. They reshape the animals over generations, altering the size of the horns, softening the texture of the coats to produce wool, and modifying the body shape to maximize the yield of meat and fat. The wild ancestors fade away, replaced by submissive creatures reliant on human protection against the wolves and the lions. It's a process demanding constant vigilance and endless labor. They guide the herds to the pastures, guard them through the night, and deliver their young, intertwining the bloodlines of the animals with the survival of the village. The control seems like a monumental triumph over the chaos of the natural world, a mastery of the living earth. They mold the stalks of the wheat and the bones of the sheep to fit their exact needs. But you don't enter into a bargain with nature without paying a hidden price. As the humans bind the plants and the animals to their will, who is truly domesticating whom in this silent, dusty exchange? The triumph of agriculture carries a devastating curse, locking humanity inside a prison built of their own design. The shift from the wandering path of the hunter to the static, brutal labor of the farmer exacts a catastrophic toll on the human body. The skeletal remains pulled from the dirt of the early farming villages reveal a dark truth hiding behind the surplus of grain. The early farmers stand shorter than their hunter-gatherer ancestors, their growth stunted by a monotonous, narrow diet relying heavily on carbohydrates and lacking the rich diversity of wild proteins and roots. Look at the jaws of these ancient labourers. Their teeth show deep cavities and severe enamel defects, a permanent record of the sugars and the grit worn into the flour during the milling process. Listen to the heavy, exhausted, rhythmic scraping of a rough grinding stone rubbing against a basalt basin, a sound echoing the physical destruction of the human spine. The women kneel for hours on the hard clay floors, pushing the stones back and forth to turn the hard kernels into edible flour. The repetitive motion crushes their joints, wearing down the cartilage in their knees and compressing the vertebrae in their backs, leaving their skeletons permanently deformed by the daily grind. The men shatter their shoulders hacking at the dense earth with primitive hoes, digging the endless irrigation trenches required to keep the crops alive under the burning sun. The working days stretch from the first light of dawn until the fading of the twilight, a relentless cycle of planting, weeding and harvesting, replacing the sporadic, adrenaline-fueled bursts of the hunt. The dense packing of humans and animals into the muddy villages creates a breeding ground for invisible terrors. The proximity to the pigs and the sheep allows diseases to jump the species barrier, introducing a wave of new infections sweeping through the mud brick houses. The crowded conditions guarantee the rapid spread of sickness, while the reliance on a single crop leaves the entire village vulnerable to total starvation if a drought or a swarm of locusts destroys the harvest. A valley once supporting a few hundred healthy, robust foragers now groans under the weight of thousands of sick, exhausted farmers. You can't escape the structural trap once the jaws snap shut. the population density skyrockets, fueled by the sheer volume of calories the grain provides. If a village attempts to abandon the fields and return to the wandering life of the hunt, they face immediate catastrophic famine, because the wild landscape can no longer support the inflated numbers. They chain themselves to the fields, trading their freedom and their health for the illusion of security. The agricultural trap closes around the species, offering no exit and no chance for a retreat. Though it stands as a terrible deal for the individual, breaking their bodies and narrowing their horizons, this insidious trap springs simultaneously across the globe. The invisible pull of domestication isn't an isolated event confined to the dusty valleys of the Middle East. The climate stabilizes across the entire planet, and the human mind, facing identical pressures of population growth and shrinking wild territories, invents the same solution in completely isolated corners of the globe. The timeline echoes with global rhymes, a parallel evolution of agriculture sprouting in diverse lush landscapes. Far to the east, along the winding banks of the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers in China, different hands begin to mold the earth. They cultivate wild rice and millet, transforming the unpredictable swamps into terraced, controlled ecosystems. Listen to the wet, squelching sound of feet wading through the flooded rice paddies in the pouring monsoon rain, the water splashing against the stalks as the farmers bend to plant the fragile shoots into the submerged mud. Across the oceans, in the dense jungles and high plateaus of Mesoamerica, another agricultural miracle unfolds over thousands of years. The indigenous hands take a wild grass called teosinte, bearing tiny hard kernels encased in an impenetrable shell, and selectively breed it until it surrenders its tough exterior, transforming into the massive golden cobs of maize. They don't stop with the corn. They weave a complex agricultural system, planting the climbing vines of beans to wrap around the tall stalks of maize, while the broad shading leaves of the squash protect the soil below from the burning sun. It's a masterpiece of botanical engineering, accomplished without a single line of written text. Deep in the isolated, mist-shrouded highlands of New Guinea, the tribes clear the dense forest canopy to plant the starchy roots of taro, the heavy tubers of yams, and the sweet flesh of bananas. They dig intricate drainage ditches through the steep mountainsides to prevent the heavy rains from washing their precious soil into the valleys. These scattered regions do not communicate with one another. The farmers in China don't copy the techniques of the Maya, and the tribes in New Guinea don't receive instructions from the Levant. They independently solve the universal puzzle of a warming climate and an expanding population, using the specific plants their local environments offer. You can't point to a single genius inventing the concept of the farm. The human brain reacts to the same environmental triggers by attempting to control the chaos of nature, binding the species to the earth in a synchronized global movement. The wet squelch of the rice paddy, the dry rustle of the maize, and the heavy chopping of the yam root combine to form a new symphony of human existence. From these scattered, localized seeds of relentless labor, the very geometry of human living space was about to change forever. The accumulation of grain and the anchoring of the populations pull the scattered villages together, compressing the humans into the first true towns. 10,000 years ago, the settlement of Jericho rises in the Jordan Valley, hosting hundreds, perhaps thousands of people within its boundaries. They stack mud bricks to build sprawling tells, raising a massive stone wall and a towering circular stone tower pointing toward the sky, a defensive monument declaring their permanent ownership of the spring flowing beneath the foundations. 2,000 years later, the dense claustrophobic marvel of Çatalhöyük emerges on the plains of Anatolia. They don't build streets. They pack the mud brick houses so tightly together the walls touch, creating a continuous solid block of human habitation stretching across the landscape. To navigate this ancient labyrinth, the inhabitants walk across the flat roofs of the dwellings, using wooden ladders to descend through small holes in the ceilings into the dim, smoky interiors below. Listen to the smooth, wet slosh of plaster being spread by calloused hands over a clay floor, the sound echoing within the windowless, soot-stained walls. The inhabitants live in an intense claustrophobic intimacy, surrounded by the physical artifacts of their beliefs. The plastered skulls of the dead rest on the shelves, their eye sockets filled with white seashells staring blankly into the firelight, preserving the faces of the ancestors within the realm of the living. Massive plaster reliefs of bullhorns protrude from the walls, casting long, terrifying shadows mimicking the beasts roaming the plains outside. The connection to the dead goes deeper than the plastered skulls. When a member of the family passes away, they don't carry the body to a distant cemetery. They dig a hole directly into the floor of the living space, fold the corpse into a tight fetal position, and bury them beneath the hearth. They spread a fresh, wet layer of plaster over the grave, sealing the ancestors beneath their feet, and continue to sleep, eat, and talk directly over the bones. You won't find a starker contrast to the wandering freedom of the ancient hunters. The floor beneath them literally contains the history of their bloodline. This permanent stacking of generations creates an unbreakable physical bond to the specific patch of dirt they inhabit. They guard the plastered rooms with their lives, because the house itself serves as the tomb of the family. The air hangs heavy with the smell of wood smoke and dried earth, a permanent cocoon isolating the town from the wild chaos outside the walls. When you live your entire life permanently resting on top of your ancestors, breathing the smoke of the same hearth for centuries, what happens to the invisible, dangerous concepts of status and ownership? The surplus of grain pouring into the towns fundamentally fractures the ancient equality of the hunter-gatherer bands. In the days of the wandering hunt, a person owned only what they could carry on their back, making the hoarding of wealth physically impossible. Now, the heavy final thud of a wooden lid sealing over a massive clay bin full of harvested grain echoes the closing of that egalitarian chapter. The town of Çatalhöyük stores the surplus in specialized plaster bins, creating a physical manifestation of wealth defying the natural decay of the wild. This stored energy changes the social fabric, giving birth to permanent specialized roles dividing the inhabitants into distinct classes of labor and authority. You don't need every member of the town digging in the dirt if the bins are full. The surplus frees the hands of a select few to step away from the fields and focus on mastering new crafts. Potters spend their days spinning the clay, weavers interlock the threads of flax and wool to create fine textiles, and storage managers emerge to calculate the distribution of the grain. Ritual leaders step into the light, claiming to interpret the will of the unseen forces and using their authority to justify the unequal distribution of the harvest. The concept of property crystallizes into a rigid law, as families claim exclusive ownership over the specific bins of grain and the plastered rooms built over the bones of their ancestors. The wealth transfers down the bloodlines, creating generations of inherited privilege and inherited debt. The physical remains of the towns reveal the subtle shifting of gender roles, etched permanently into the bone. The skeletons of the women show the extreme repetitive wear of grinding the grain and managing the domestic space, tying their labor directly to the hearth. The men's skeletons display the stresses of building the massive walls, hauling the heavy timbers, and engaging in the violent, organized conflicts erupting between neighboring settlements, fighting over the fertile land. The autonomy of the forager vanishes, replaced by the rigid expectations of the town. The invisible lines of status push outward, connecting the towns to distant resources. The inhabitants of Anatolia control the flow of obsidian, the sharp, volcanic glass serving as the steel of the ancient world. They strike the black rock into lethal blades and trade it across vast distances, exchanging the stones for exotic shells and rare woods. The merchants walk the trade routes, carrying the wealth of the towns across the mountains. These settlements seem large and complex, holding thousands of lives within their walls, but they represent only a rehearsal. They were about to be eclipsed by something truly monstrous and magnificent rising in the mud of Mesopotamia. 3,500 years before the Common Era, the damp, muddy plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers give birth to a machine of unprecedented scale. The city of Uruk erupts from the Mesopotamian mud, dwarfing the ancient towns and pulling tens of thousands of people into its sprawling, chaotic embrace. The landscape bends entirely to the will of the city. The inhabitants dig vast networks of irrigation canals, slicing the desert into geometric grids of green, forcing the rivers to bleed their life-giving water directly into the fields. They don't just grow enough to survive, they generate staggering surpluses, harvesting thousands of tons of barley and shearing mountains of wool from the bleating herds of sheep. The sheer volume of the harvest demands a level of organization the human mind has never encountered. Listen to the chaotic, overlapping hum of a massive marketplace, the shouts of the merchants and the bleating of the livestock layering over the slow, muddy, relentless dredging of a nearby canal. The air smells of baking bread, sweat, and the wet river clay baking under the brutal sun. The center of the city hosts vast temple complexes, monumental structures resting on stepped brick platforms towering over the flat plains. The priests manage the distribution of the wealth, acting as the bureaucratic heart of the Uruk machine. They oversee armies of specialized laborers, the bakers, the brewers, the smiths, and the weavers, coordinating their efforts to keep the massive city from collapsing under its own weight. To manage this overwhelming flood of resources, the administrators invent a physical system of memory. They sculpt tiny clay tokens, shaping them into cones, spheres, and cylinders to represent specific quantities of grain, oil, and livestock. They place these tokens inside hollow clay envelopes, sealing the spheres to prevent tampering, and press their personalized cylinder seals across the wet surface to mark the transaction. It's a primitive, tangible form of accounting, a way to freeze a massive economic exchange into a lump of dried mud. You can't run an empire of this magnitude relying on the fragile, fading memory of an elder. The city operates as a massive, insatiable engine, consuming raw materials and producing a complex hierarchy of power. The walls of Uruk stretch for miles, an intimidating barrier separating the organized, civilized interior from the wild, chaotic desert beyond. The mind of the administrators stretches to the breaking point, trying to keep track of the endless flow of barley and the massive flocks of sheep moving through the gates. When human memory simply runs out of space, overwhelmed by the sheer numerical weight of the city's wealth, how do you track the debts and the promises of an expanding empire? The solution to the limitations of human memory takes shape in the quiet, focused corners of the temples. The scribes realize they don't need to seal the loose tokens inside the bulky clay envelopes. They can simply press the tokens into the wet surface of the clay, leaving a two-dimensional imprint of the debt. This simple realization sparks the invention of writing. The tokens flatten into signs, and the scribes quickly abandon the physical shapes, opting instead to carve the marks directly into the mud. Listen to the crisp, wet press and the satisfying click of a sharpened reed stylus biting into a fresh tablet of soft river clay. The scribe sits in the cool shade of the temple, their hands moving with meticulous, quiet concentration, physically capturing the invisible words and locking them into the earth. This system evolves into cuneiform, a complex language of wedge-shaped impressions capturing the precise details of the empire's wealth. The early pictograms, simple drawings of barley stalks and animal heads, gradually become abstract strokes representing the sounds of the spoken language. The scribe bakes the tablet in the sun, turning the soft clay into a permanent hardened record of a debt outliving the men who forged it. Writing doesn't emerge from a desire to write poetry or record myths. It is born from the absolute necessity of counting the surplus. Yet, once the system exists, it mutates, capturing the laws, the prayers, and the stories of the kings. The phenomenon ripples across the ancient world, taking different forms in different lands. In the valley of the Nile, the Egyptian priests developed proto-hieroglyphs, carving the sacred symbols into the stone monuments and eventually simplifying the strokes into the flowing hieratic script painted onto sheets of woven papyrus. The scribes along the Indus River press their intricate, undeciphered script into the faces of the steatite seals discovered in the sprawling cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. In the late 2nd millennium before the Common Era, the diviners of the Shang dynasty in China carved their questions into oracle bones, using the heat-cracked turtle plastrons and ox scapulae to record their communications with the ancestors. You can't grasp the magnitude of this shift without recognizing writing as the ultimate external hard drive for the human species. The knowledge no longer dies with the brain holding it. The scribe presses the stylus into the clay, and the memory becomes immortal, capable of traveling hundreds of miles across the desert without losing a single detail of the message. With memory outsourced to physical matter, the rulers hold the power to project their laws and their will far beyond the visible horizon. The ancient world locks into a terrifying, unstoppable acceleration, scaling the limits of human cooperation through the brutal application of force and myth. The solid wooden wheel, initially carved to spin the potter's clay, drops to the ground and attaches to an axle. Listen to the heavy, rumbling, agonizing creak of a solid wooden wheel rolling over the sun-baked earth, carrying the weight of a war chariot toward the front lines. The discovery of bronze changes the geometry of violence. The smiths blend the soft copper with the rare tin, melting the metals in the roaring furnaces to cast swords and armor holding a lethal, unbreakable edge. The stone shatters against the bronze, giving the armies wielding the new alloy an absolute monopoly on destruction. In the year 2300 before the Common Era, Sargon of Akkad leverages these technologies to smash the independent city-states of Mesopotamia together, forging the first true empire the world has ever seen. The chariots roll across the plains, enforcing the will of a single ruler over thousands of miles of conquered territory. By 3000 before the Common Era, the disparate tribes along the Nile unite under the authority of a single pharaoh wearing the double crown, commanding the labour of millions to drag the massive limestone blocks into the geometric perfection of the early pyramids. The kings cease to be mere men. They elevate themselves to the status of living gods, using the massive surplus of grain to feed the standing armies and the armies of stonecutters. In the year 1750 before the Common Era, Hammurabi carves his written law code into a massive pillar of black basalt in Babylon, ensuring the rules of the empire remain visible and unchanging, stripping the judges of their arbitrary power. The Assyrians build a military bureaucracy running on the relentless efficiency of terror and iron, while the merchants on the Levantine coast sail from the ports of Byblos and Ugarit, connecting the empires through a web of maritime trade. As the borders expand and the cultures collide, the local, regional gods merge into vast universal deities. Amun-Ra illuminates the Egyptian sky, Marduk claims the supremacy of Babylon, and the concept of a single, omnipotent creator begins to crystallize in the minds of the desert prophets. You don't build an empire of this scale without crushing the autonomy of the individual under the wheels of the chariots. The god-kings demand absolute obedience, using the bronze weapons and the written laws to organize the masses into a synchronized machine of production and war. The momentum feels crushing, an unavoidable march toward larger and more powerful structures of control. Bound by the strict laws of the tablets and the towering shadows of the empires, humanity begins to look inward, seeking an escape from the physical chains and questioning the very nature of this constructed reality. The crushing weight of the empires sparks a profound, synchronized rebellion of the mind across the ancient world. Between 800 and 200 years before the Common Era, the Axial Age descends upon the earth, shifting the focus from the bronze swords and the stone pyramids to the invisible architecture of the soul. Listen to the quiet, dry rustling of a heavy scroll being unrolled in a silent, dust-moted library, a sound carrying the weight of a new kind of power. The clashing of the armies fades into the background, replaced by the quiet, intense conversations of the philosophers mapping the boundaries of human morality. The brilliant minds of the era rise simultaneously, separated by thousands of miles of deserts and mountains, yet asking the exact same questions about the nature of suffering, justice, and the universe. In the fragmented states of the Zhou dynasty in China, Confucius wanders the roads, teaching the profound importance of human relationships, ritual, and the cultivation of inner virtue to heal a broken society. Deep in the lush forests of India, Siddhartha Gautama sits beneath the branches of the Bodhi tree, deconstructing the illusion of the self and offering a path of liberation from the endless cycle of suffering. On the sun-drenched steppes of Greece, Socrates interrogates the citizens of Athens, tearing down their assumptions, while Plato and Aristotle construct the foundational pillars of Western reason, logic, and political thought. In the dusty hills of Israel and Judah, the prophets Amos, Isaiah, and Jeremiah rail against the corruption of the kings, demanding social justice and cementing the radical concept of an ethical, monotheistic God who values the care of the widow and the orphan above the smell of the burning sacrifices. The intellectual explosion isn't limited to morality. The Babylonian astronomers track the complex mathematical movements of the stars, recording the eclipses on their clay tablets. The Greek mathematicians, led by the precise mind of Euclid, map the rules of geometry, while the Indian scholars conceive the revolutionary concept of zero, unlocking the true potential of mathematics. You can't overstate the miracle of this synchronized awakening. Without the aid of the internet or the printing press, the isolated pockets of humanity simultaneously decide to turn their gaze inward, seeking the fundamental truths governing the cosmos. These profound thoughts, the ethical frameworks and the mathematical proofs, lay dormant in the fragile scrolls and the crumbling manuscripts for centuries. They survived the burning of the libraries and the collapse of the empires, carefully copied by hand in the quiet monasteries and the isolated temples. The ideas wait in the dark, preserving the spark of the axial age for generations. They needed a catalyst, a machine capable of multiplying the words and scattering the seeds of the philosophers across the entire globe to ignite the final revolution. The gentle, slow ticking of the ancient clock returns to your ears, but the rhythm begins to race, catching the terrifying exponential momentum of the modern age. In the middle of the 1400s, Johannes Gutenberg locks the movable metal type into the frame and pulls the heavy wooden lever of the screw press. Listen to the rhythmic, mechanical, metallic clank and press of the machine, a sound shattering the silence of the monasteries. The press stamps the ink onto the page, multiplying the knowledge of the ancients and placing the power of the written word into the hands of the masses. The ideas spread like wildfire. In 1517, Martin Luther nails his arguments to the door, fracturing the power of the church, while Copernicus, Kepler and Galileo use the printed pages to realign the heavens, proving the earth orbits the sun. The Enlightenment sweeps through the minds of Locke, Voltaire and Paine, using the printing press to tear down the divine right of the kings. The metallic clank of the press accelerates, dissolving seamlessly into the deafening roar of the Industrial Revolution. The furnaces burn the ancient coal, boiling the water to drive the steam engines, pumping the lifeblood of the new factories. The population explodes alongside the machines. From a mere 500 million souls in the year 1500, the number doubles to 1 billion in 1800, surges to 1.6 billion in 1900, and skyrockets past 6 billion by the year 2000. Today, 8 billion human beings breathe the air of the planet, connected by the invisible webs of the digital age. The heavy gears of the steam engines fade into the quiet, continuous hum of the computer servers, holding the sum of all human knowledge in their glowing microscopic transistors. You trace a straight, unbroken line from the first spark struck in the dark savannah to the smartphone resting on your nightstand. It's a dizzying, terrifying, beautiful ascent. We started as a fragile band of 1,280 individuals surviving the volcanic winter, and we stand today as an interconnected superorganism reshaping the very geology of the Earth. We don't often stop to feel the weight of that journey, the 250,000 years of silence purchasing the loud, chaotic luxury of the modern night. As the hum of the servers blends into the quiet rhythm of your own breathing, let the timeline collapse back into the shadows. You hold the unbroken line of their survival inside your DNA. You are the direct descendant of the hunters who braved the ice, the artist who painted the caves, and the sailors who crossed the dark oceans. Close your eyes and feel the immense quiet strength of that lineage settling over your tired mind. Sleep well, knowing you carry their fire into tomorrow. If this journey brought you peace, leave a gentle like or subscribe before the screen goes dark, and let the whispers of history carry you into a deep, untroubled rest. Good night.